allow me to introduce our panel. Joining me, we've got Sally North from WorkSafe, the Deputy WorkSafe Commissioner, who's got more than 20 years' experience as an inspector and leader with WorkSafe. We've got Caitlin Rintoul, who's an investigative reporter at the West Australian and the Sunday Times for Seven West Media, and has received a Walkley Award, as many of you I think will know, in recognition of her investigation into sexual harassment and assault in the resources sector. Rejoining me, we've got Rebecca Tompkinson, who you met earlier today already, from the Chamber of Minerals and Energy, the CEO there. And we've got Chris Erickson from Atlas Iron, who's the General Manager of Technology and Information Management. She's responsible there for a team accountable for delivering ongoing improvement to all things tech and IT. Can you join me in welcoming my panellists? Again, I just want to give a little bit of context to the conversation we're about to have before we jump into it. So it goes without saying that journalism has played a pretty critical role in Australia's media and political landscape in recent years, not just in the mining industry, but more broadly covering the issue of sexual harassment and violence against women across a number of industries. Our Watch CEO, Paddy Kinnersley, has made the point repeatedly that research shows that sexual harassment is preventable and that good reporting is part of the solution. Evidence-based media reporting on sexual harassment can change attitudes and behaviours that ultimately lead to violence against women. So we're here today to talk about responsible, informed reporting, and not just in the sense of the media. We're going to talk about workplace cultures that encourage reporting or inappropriate behaviour being called out. They've got a critical role to play, as does appropriate reporting to the regulator. So that's our conversation. We're going to touch on the roles of the various parties, informing the public on industry issues, obligations to report, etc., and how we can work better together with the media to provide fair and balanced information as well. So Caitlin, I feel like I have to come to you as the person that broke this open and played a really crucial role in the conversation, in setting the ground for the conversation that we're having today. Your tireless reporting was really the origin of part of this, ultimately prompting the parliamentary inquiry. How do you think about the role of media, companies, regulators when it comes to covering and reporting on issues of sexual harassment in the industry?
Well, I'll start. That is quite a big and complex question. But I think when it comes to media's reporting, and where I really started with this is with people. I mean, we are there to tell stories, to help people find justice when they have other avenues haven't worked out for them. I think in Western Australia, everyone in this room obviously knows someone who works in the FIFO industry or someone who works in mining. I was one of those people. I haven't worked in the industry myself, but I heard stories from people who wanted a platform. And unfortunately, because of where we were a couple years ago before this reporting, some of the people who came to me felt that there wasn't appropriate avenues in mining. They felt that there wasn't places to go through the watchdog or internally through the company that they worked. So when it came to the media's role and where this all started, we were kind of an outsider who provided a place for survivors to go to really share their stories and shake things up.
So Caitlin, you mentioned there where we were a few years ago. Have you, even from that outsider's angle, felt like you've watched progress be made over the last couple of years?
Absolutely. The stories that I was hearing initially are horrific. I mean, we all heard them in the testimonies to the parliamentary inquiry, absolute horror stories. But it's not to say that that isn't still going on today, but from what we've heard throughout the panel discussions and in the speeches early on, there's been incredible investment, hundreds of millions of dollars by companies who are represented in this room. I mean, we had Steve Campbell from BHP earlier say that just on their villages alone to make sure that it was making people feel safe and inclusive, they've spent $300 million. I mean, that's incredible that a story, someone's story coming forward can do that and can cause that tangible change. So yeah, throughout the inquiry, we definitely heard of companies that were trying their best, and there's ongoing work to do, of course, but there's so many people in this room who are putting the best foot forward and trying to change the industry for the better.
Sally, Caitlin mentioned there the power of stories. And I think one of the things I know you're passionate about is how do we create the safety inside our workplaces that stories speaking up, calling out that needs to happen, happens. What do we need to do to create that sort of culture?
Thank you. It's a really big challenge, and I think that having a public narrative around the issue, around the kind of harm and the effects that it can have, like we heard this morning from Professor Parker, the real significance of the impacts, and making that really clear to people that this is actually something that does impact significantly, both in terms of harm and also flowing on from that in terms of business as well, and having that really better understood across industry is an important starting point. And while I think the conversation that we've had and the parliamentary inquiry focused specifically on issues affecting women, I think the opportunities here are to include other at-risk groups as part of that dialogue. And the other opportunities are that having the conversations helps in some way to break down stigma associated with raising these issues, and whether people in particular contexts have the confidence in the context that they're in to raise an issue under their own name and to do so explicitly. We might not be there in many cases, but if we also have opportunities to report anonymously, that can still provide useful data to assist us to drive change.
Thank you for that. And I don't want to preempt the questions, but I have a feeling we might delve into some of the complexities of that a little bit further, a little bit later. Chris, I want to come to you though. You talk about the role of transparency when you're running a mine site. And I guess building on what we were just talking about with Sally there, one of the things that came up in the conversation we were having about contractors earlier today is sort of how do you move away from that blame and shame culture? Where people are prepared to report, where people seek to understand and commit to improving. How have you found that from your standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question, Holly. Atlas Iron is part of the Hancock Prospecting Group, and Hancock Operations takes this very seriously, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because the only way that we're going to thrive as a mining industry is if we have diversity and performance diversity in the workplace. Saying that, it's a long journey. Before the Enough is Enough report, we commenced a lot of work around above and below the line behaviours, but acknowledging that there was much more to do. And so we opened up the transparency in terms of reporting avenues from ethics officers, chaplains, anonymous platforms, wellbeing reps, to encouraging the reporting. But I guess that's not enough, and it's paying lip service to some extent. It's what we do behind that. And it's the leadership team accepting and acknowledging that we have a problem, and being very transparent and communicate about where we have incidents, whether they be alleged assault, or whether they be incidents which are below the iceberg, but the more you stamp out those behaviours, the less likely you're going to get to an alleged sexual assault. So the final point around that is that we need to encourage the transparency, and a lot of that is through our leaders. We need to equip our leaders who have often been brought up through operational, frontline, sometimes male-dominated environments, and so we need to help them to be able to have the conversations, to understand how to respond, hence the program in terms of leadership capability.
And Chris, while we're on it, can I ask you about another adaptation for leaders at the moment, which is really around adapting to the legislative change? Now psychosocial safety now needing to be treated the way that we would traditional, sort of OH&S or work health and safety. How are you seeing leaders adapt? What new capability do we need to build in our leaders to make that adaptation successful culturally?
I think there's it's treating it a little bit like physical safety to get people onto the same path, right? Is the different tiers of safety incidents and how do you respond to those, and using the data to address each of them. But I think there's this other component around this is not a technical leadership problem, this is an adaptive one. And it's to your point previously around the type of leaders that we want to create. We want people who have a growth mindset, that are open and curious and learning. And so a lot of the programs we do, for example, at Atlas, is about growth mindsets. How do you solve problems, technical problems, or adaptive problems with adaptive solutions?
You hear? Rebecca, we spoke this morning and quite passionately for you about the need to be making sure we're attracting women into this industry. What role does the conversation we're having about reporting play in that for you? What's the link and the juncture between the conversation we're having now and that ability to attract and retain talent?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And it's really a pleasure to be on the panel with everybody this afternoon. I think adding on to those comments is ensuring that the workplace is safe. So if we know that you can come in and there's going to be an ability to talk about what you're experiencing in a way that is strengths-based, that has a tangible, direct outcome that is going to be listened to. Caitlin picked up and made a comment that people didn't feel that there were pathways within our industry where they could talk about what was happening for them. Well, that's not good enough. There has to be pathways, multiple pathways for people to be able to disclose what's occurring in any circumstance within their workplace. And so the direct correlation is the more that we can have a culture that talks to Chris's transparency, then the stronger people will feel about being able to take that risk, to come in. What I want to be able to say is come and have a look. It is changing. Take a leap of faith with us, come on in and have a look. And those programs and the processes that we're putting in place to make that change on the ground need to deliver that.
Here, and I love that point around multiple pathways too, making sure that we're facilitating all manner of ways in which people can feel safe, given different positions of power, nature of lived experience, safety, risk, etc., to be able to make sure that they can speak out. I want to come to your questions. There's a great number of them flooding my iPad, which is fabulous. Caitlin, I'm going to come to you first, but I want to have a broader conversation around how we think about privacy and the management of that through reporting. The question that's been asked here is what's sort of the media's role in protecting victims, demonstrating care and protecting their stories? But to add in for the question I'll come to the rest of the panel on, there's also this question around how do we manage the tension between employer reporting obligations and an individual who wishes to retain anonymity. So media's view first, Caitlin, around how do you kind of protect victims, demonstrate care and protect privacy? And then I'd love the views of the panel around that broader question on employer reporting obligations.
Yeah, so I think the media generally has a big responsibility to play in protecting victims, protecting survivors in their story. And fortunately, you did mention earlier Our Watch, which is an incredible organisation which is, spreading that message nationally to all media outlets in Australia. So that is a great resource, and it's one that I have referred to throughout this reporting, but also internally within individual media organisations at the West Australian. I have incredible resources and a great team who help me when stories that are quite sensitive do come through. We make sure that we always include helplines and be incredibly sensitive with how we deliver these stories. But yeah, when someone does approach you and they do want to be confidential, there is a way to still have impact and be able to tell that story. I think if anyone did follow my reporting in the early days, a lot of some of the initial stories were didn't feature someone's name or someone's face. But I mean, look at us today. We are in this room, and those stories matter. So it isn't just people don't have to put themselves out there and completely tell their whole lives to be able to have impact. But there was a number of women who did come through throughout my reporting and throughout the parliamentary inquiry, and they are incredibly brave people. But yes, it is a big decision to make, and I suppose that comes to companies as well when people are reporting their story. Sometimes they don't want to have their name attached to it. And in the early days, I spoke about a lack of access and avenues that people felt comfortable with. One of the big complaints that I was hearing was that they wanted to tell their story, they wanted action, but they didn't want to have their name attached to it. They wanted a safe, confidential avenue. And whether that was an issue in that internal company or through the watchdog, it was definitely in some cases, which we did hear throughout the inquiry. There has been a number of changes to that recently, and I think it was just yesterday, police brought out Safe to Say, which was a recommendation through the inquiry. So, you asked me earlier about whether there has been change and whether I've been satisfied with some of it. That's something that I'm really proud that has come out of the inquiry.
Absolutely, you should be. Others, this tension around sort of managing reporting obligations and individual desire for privacy and maintaining anonymity through these processes. Any thoughts?
I think privacy is paramount. I think people's ability to be able to talk to what's happening, but also to protect their individual aspects of that. And also, we're talking about something incredibly deeply personal and very challenging. And so, again, to those multiple pathways in which we can enable people to feel comfortable to talk to what's happening. And as Caitlin's touched on, there are methodologies within confidential reporting that can enable organisations to address behavioural change and can look at the data and to show so that people can have confidence that by being able to talk to the situation that there will be change. I said this morning, we need to be honest with each other. We do need to make change on the ground. We know that we want to have diverse, respectful, safe workplaces for every single person in every single organisation, not just this industry. And the ability to utilise the techniques that we're developing, and we are still all learning. That's what's fabulous about having so many people in the room to share those understandings, to understand the complexity of the problem in front of us, and to find together in partnership ways with our regulators, way with our media, way with our organisations, with our HR teams, that we can ensure the privacy of the individual, that we can ensure as well that we are making change on the ground.
Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's also a balance in terms of reporting incidents to the media and to the regulator, for example, and the police. And recently we did have an incident on one of our sites. We stood up a incident management team. We reported to the regulator in a very timely manner, and we gave support to all those involved. And I think one of the things that we do is to respect the privacy of individuals, and not just those that have been affected, but those who have responded. So all of the parties involved. Some of what we report internally and communication has to be quite limited, but it's important for us, we feel, to be able to talk about, well, we have had an incident, and observe the privacy so that people know. And then when we do know the full report, we actually report that back and say, well, these are our learnings and this is how we're going to change our leader programs, for example, as a result. And that's a constant communications.
That accountability loop too of following through on this is what we're going to do about it, this is what we've learnt, these are the practices, the behaviours, the things that were happening that clearly we need to make a change around is a really critical part of what you just said there, Chris. Sally, while we're talking about this, there's a question that's come through around, just speaking of reporting, getting clarity around the intersection of sexual harassment and notifiable incidents under WHS. So someone just saying, I'd love some clarity around that. Do you want to speak to it?
Yes, certainly. That has been something that's come up quite frequently. We have got some published guidance, and I would encourage you, if anybody hasn't seen that, to have a look on our website for a document around reporting incidents of sexual harassment or sexual assault to the regulator that does provide some guidance. But essentially there's two components to the duties to notify. The first one is around there are some specified kind of consequences from an event. So things like lost time, medical treatment and so forth. So if any of those criteria are met, then it is notifiable under the Act. And in addition to that, under our mine safety regulations, there's a requirement, a broader requirement for events that are potentially harmful to be notified as well. So the guidance provides some examples as to how that works, but essentially what that means is that we are saying that events such as sexual assault and sexual harassment should be notified, and in doing that we are also very conscious of the issues around personal confidentiality and so forth. And our work as a regulator, it's largely around prevention, and what we are focusing on is safe systems of work and things that can be preventative, and we've heard some examples of those today. So we are able to do a lot with information about, I guess, the type of event that's gone on, in terms of asking questions around what those systems of work were at the time of that incident, and any reflections on those in light of incident, or indeed trends in relation to that.
And Sally, I might stay with you for a moment. Just a pointed question around the functionality of this new 24/7 sort of reporting line. Will anonymous reports through the new line be communicated to the site or the employer so that they can take action to support the person?
So in terms of the reporting line, it's a reporting, it's also for advice. So there's going to be a range of things that we expect will come through on that line, and we will take those on a case-by-case basis. So some people will be seeking advice in terms of something that they might be experiencing, and we would seek to provide them advice around, the resources that are there to support them and what steps they might take. We're also expecting we'll get calls from people that have witnessed behaviours or witnessed concerns, things that they're concerned about, and also from people in management and employers and so forth seeking clarity around what to do. So we're not automatically going to be going to sites with all of those things. What we're going to do is try and assist people with what their specific issues are. Some of those matters that will come through may well be notifications from employers or concerns from people. People might want us to take action in specific cases, and what we'll endeavour to do there is explain what we can offer, also what other agencies can offer, because they're not people that come through to us. They've got a variety of outcomes that they're seeking, so we'll talk through that with them. And if they're interested in us taking some action, then we will take those details and we will seek some advice from that person reporting as to whether or not the way they want us to take it forward, as in anonymous, or whether they're happy for an incident to be raised and would indeed like us to do it in that way.
Caitlin, question for you. Someone's come through here saying reporting can be particularly stressful for a survivor. As someone who's been a custodian in a lot of these stories and met people in quite acute moments of distress, I imagine, with what they've experienced and sharing what they've been through, what changes need to be made to manage that impact, and what observations, or what have you heard from people who've shared their stories with you around that actual care and concern they would have liked to have seen for them in those moments around how can we make it less stressful?
So, I'm still in contact with people today that were behind some of those initial stories. So I think when these incidents happen, they're lifelong for people. They're things that people will be thinking about for years or months or, their whole life afterwards. So I think one of the main things would be to ensure that there's that follow-up, to ensure that those services don't just cut off, after the investigation closes. Another one would be for their families. Like, this could be incredibly stressful for the close family members, for the partner of someone, even for the colleagues, the bystanders who were there. So making sure that employee assistance programs extend across to the whole family, which is something that has been included in the Chamber of Minerals and Energy's piece out yesterday. So that would definitely be a strong one. In terms of, can you just repeat
Or just that piece around how do we emotionally make reporting less stressful for people, whether there was any insights you'd gleaned from people you've shared the stories of or spoken to through this?
I think the point that Sally made earlier around letting people have control of how their story is told. You said if someone calls in, Sally, that they can seek advice, they can say how they would like to approach it, or if, they can sit back and say, I want a little bit more time to think, or is there anyone else I can talk to? So maybe giving people a little bit more flexibility in how they want to take their concerns forward would be a good place to start.
Anyone got anything to add on that one? Yeah, go for it, Sally.
Yeah. Just also that we're conscious around the stress associated with actually telling the story and making it clear that we can accept a kind of, people can tell us at a high level what's happened. We don't need a lot of detail. We don't have to ask for a lot of detail around that incident, because providing that detail can be quite traumatic for people. So we are conscious about that in taking calls from people.
And can I just add to that?
Go for it, Taylor.
Often it is traumatising for people to have to keep on retelling their story. So, having systems in place where someone doesn't have to continuously meeting a new face, pouring their heart out, telling them, traumatic events, I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Got a question here around, and it was something Warren touched on in the fireside conversation this morning, the success, I truly think, as someone who worked in the industry 10 years ago, the safety share is still ingrained in the way that my brain works. It's such a powerful discipline, I think, of the way the industry works. And we're good at doing that from a physical safety hazard standpoint. So the question asked here is, how can we shift that practice for psychosocial hazards without diluting the physical safety element? Chris, I know you mentioned psychosocial safety before. How are you thinking through practices like that? Because that has been so successful within the industry at really driving the incident rate down in a traditional sense. How do we think about adapting practices like that?
When you think about it, you wonder why we didn't do it before, right? If you think about it, we've reported on physical safety incidents and improvements. We've got a great cadence, and why aren't we treating psychosocial the same? I think this room is representation, and who's here is that we are acknowledging that and doing that. As I said before, our approach is to provide the avenues for reporting, but then to break down the events. Some is on one scale, will be a sexual assault alleged, right down to a very minor. But we want to actually address each of them and address the, below the iceberg and, what's above the water as well, and be able to respond to each of those by applying the learnings back into our weekly comms, for example. What did we learn out of, for example, we've all got social media platforms such as Teams or Zoom, other chat functions. Often people may not have an idea that what you use that corporate platform for is different to what you may use Facebook or LinkedIn for. And you see a blurring of the lines and some inappropriate type of chats through the Teams function, and that's treated as an incident, and it's reviewed, investigated, and then the learnings are tabled back through to our weekly leader huddle through at Roy Hill and now at Atlas as well. So I think those sorts of things and the consistency in getting the cadence rolled out through to all the pre-starts, every other forum that we use physical safety to communicate and learn is the same approach. So
I feel like I'm hearing that really clearly today, this through line around, have you got the data? Are you using the data? Have you got the data? To your point around, are we capturing it? Are we feeding it back to leaders in a way that's informing conversation and action? Rebecca, I want to come to you on the same question. Safety share has been such a powerful discipline in the industry. How do you think about the adaptation of that, or what we add in as we expand to now this idea of psychosocial coming into the conversation?
I think it's a really big and. I mean, we leverage the same practices that we've undertaken because we know that methodology works, and we utilise it in a psychosafety element. We launched yesterday our Supporting Safe and Respectful Behaviours Industry Action Plan, and in that talks to some of the things that our companies are already doing in this space, such as holding a whole day of no production work to talk about an issue like this, to actually talk on site around what's happening in facilitated conversations for people to be able to share those experiences. Because what we're also understanding is that people's perception and appreciation of what is okay in the workplace does still today vary, despite some of the incredible training that's been undertaken and despite the ongoing education processes that we put in place. We have very extensive onboarding, very extensive induction. We have very extensive understanding of what sexual harassment, sexual assault is, but still people need an opportunity to continue to engage in that and to be shown where they've learned behaviours that are inappropriate, how we can address those. And that's really what we did in that safety share. We said, you know how when you jumped on that ladder and you didn't have anyone hold it, that was unsafe. And that sounds clumsy, and I don't mean to minimise it in that regard, but what I'm saying is that we actually have to talk about it because people's understanding is different from person to person. And when you can put it in that human context of this is how I felt when you did that, then we really have a level playing field of the appreciation of the complexity of why it's so important to have behaviours that support everyone to be able to do the best job they can every day, whether that be the physical safety of the site process, the psychological element of what it's like to be present in this workplace. We also know that diversity adds strength to that. And we know that part of what happened when we really focused on a safety first culture, because we were talking about it, because we were present in it, that led to that level of change. This is the same. We need to continue to talk about it. We need to be present to understanding what that means on the ground.
I think you've really nicely addressed, though. I welcome anyone to add in another question that came through around what role does providing a safe and probably regular, in that answer, space to talk about lived experience and share play and actually reporting of psychosocial. So making it a part of that rhythm, what we've got eyes up for, what we're alert to. Anything to add there in anyone's commentary there? Yep.
But just how important it is to be able to address it at the time
Yes.
as well. You know, the immediacy of an action being taking place, and by bystander and upstander training is all about helping people have the language to be able to identify behaviour that's not okay and have the skill to be able to address that.
Can I double click on that language? And Chris, you can maybe add in for me if you like. You know, I never like to make assumptions that we are using terms we understand. We've heard bystander a bit. It's a bit more common in our vernacular. Upstander, can you just double click on that for a moment, Rebecca, and talk to us about what that means? Or Chris, if you want to take that. I just think it's important. You know, we're introducing a term there that's got a lot more to do with proactivity and positivity in terms of our actions and behaviours. Can you clarify it?
Yeah, and it's not about blaming someone. It's a bit like what you talked about, Holly, around what you walk past is the standard you set. And you know, we've a similar program in terms of upstanders and bystanders. Upstanders are those who will call out behaviours, poor behaviours, but also good behaviours, because we want this to be a positive experience working in the workforce overall. So, yeah. Great.
Did you want to add something too, Chris? I know you were about to speak up when I asked you that curly question there about upstanding. I'll have another curly question, and again, one that's come through here. How do we treat vexatious reports? How do we deal with ones that might have other motivations, or there might be some elements to them that, again, that's complicated, because vexatious can mean that I've seen baseless vexatious reporting, and I've seen, you know, reporting that had a little bit of spice to it but had a lot of truth to it as well. How do you think through the complexity of, I guess, when a report comes through, how you work out what's going on there? Chris, it sounds like you've been through this.
I think it's a difficult one, but I think that what we have to do is learn how to demonstrate procedural fairness, and acknowledge that you know, a person impacted is one party in the whole party, and until we've done the investigation, then we've got to observe confidentiality and maintain impartiality. It's quite easy to put our own biases over situations, and it's really important that we are trained and equipped, particularly leaders, to be able to do a thorough investigation.
Okay, well, I imagine you've had to contend with that too from a reporting standpoint as well, getting to the truth of what, you know, when you get a tip off and when you hear something is the case, you know, going through the process of procedural fairness is a good word. I'm sure there's another term in media and journalism for how you think through that. Anything you want to add there?
I think, you know, a lot of these stories initially was very uncomfortable for people to hear. Like a lot of people in this room, you take pride in your workplace. So to have headlines that are pretty
Unsavoury?
Unsavoury, yes, unsavoury.
Diplomatic?
It can hurt. It can really hurt. But the media's role, I mean, we don't come forward with malice intent. Like, we are here to share concerns in the community, to raise issues, to help individuals who feel unheard. So it's often we do cop a lot of criticism, but we are here for the people, and that's the base of what we do and what I certainly do and have done throughout this reporting. When it comes to internally, we do get a lot of tip-offs, and we, again, have great resources, an incredible team. We also have in-house lawyers who I've spent many of hours talking to as part of this reporting to make sure that we are offering you know, a fair platform, and we are doing our due diligence and trying to speak to as many people who surround the incidents that we report on.
Sally, you wanted to jump in?
I did. I just, in terms of the procedural fairness, I think that's a great way of looking at this question. I just want to highlight as well that when a report comes in, you know, you've got the person making the report and the respondent, the other party, and whether or not, you know, if the other party has done something they shouldn't have, or if they haven't, in both cases, it's important to remember the welfare needs of both parties, because it is a very stressful time actually for both parties in that situation, and you know, whether or not, you know, they've done something they shouldn't have, they still should be looked after and supported. And I'd really just encourage to make sure that businesses have got systems in place to look after everybody involved in reports of that type.
I want to bring us back to the kind of the banner that we gathered under to talk about in this conversation, which is around how we raise the profile of reporting in the name of creating safer workplaces. If you had to think about distilling that down to sort of one suggestion or bit of advice from a tangible, this is a how or this is a what, I'd love a suggestion from each of you of something everyone in the room could take away and think about the application of to their context at work. Who wants to start? Sal, go for it.
What I would suggest is that, you know, we all understand there's a huge amount of underreporting, and I would be encouraging you to really try and get a sense of the extent to which that's an issue at your workplace. So you know, you have some data about reports. What don't you have? And how can you find out more about what you don't have? How can you seek some inputs from people around the extent to which they would or wouldn't have or haven't reported those issues to you? And also the extent to which they're familiar with the means by which they can report. So hopefully you've got multiple means by which they can report. Do people know that? And when I say people, we talked in the previous session around different types of employment relationships. So it'd be really great if you understood this across those different relationships to make sure that people both knew all the ways that they could report something and to what level they have that confidence. And that would then assist you in identify any, you know, issues arising around that confidence and what your next steps might be there.
So for people who might not have been in the last session, when you speak to the different relationships, do you want to just clarify that a little bit further?
In the last session, there was discussion around contractors and you know, principals and employees of both, and part of that conversation was around trying to draw those together and look more holistically at workers and have systems in place, you know, that encompass all of those.
Great, thank you. Caitlin?
I would second Sally's point around understanding your workplace, making sure that you are out there getting that data and then you are acting on it. I think initially I tried to talk to people who I would have assumed would have had a fair knowledge of what was going on in the industry, and it was fresh to their ears. It was confronting and surprising to them. They, you know, said to me that they didn't even have an inkling that it was going on in the mining industry. So just make sure that you get across the workplace as much as possible, and you also offer as many opportunities as possible for people to come forward. You know, we've heard about peer listening groups. There needs to be platforms for people to be able to share their story, and in multiple ways, because of course we are all complex. We don't want to tell our stories through the same avenues. And then also, as Sally mentioned, I would totally agree, make sure the resources are out there. If it's not something that someone is comfortable reporting internally, you know, where else can they go? Is there an option through the regulator or through an external agency? So just make sure that those resources are available for employees.
Right, so tackling underreporting, multiple paths and options to report. What would you add, Rebecca?
Visibility.
Yep.
So I feel that, particularly I touched on it this morning, you know, we have very privileged roles, and being able to talk to those experiences and to be able to normalise that this is an okay thing to talk about. I think for some of us of a certain generation, you didn't talk about this. And the more that we can encourage people to be able to have a courageous conversation, I think that's where that underreporting piece stems from, that how do you talk about this? And the more that we can be putting a light on, like the state government's initiative launched today on the 1-800 Speak Up, encouraging that this is what we want to hear what's happening. We want to be able to do something about it, because to that data piece, if we don't have the reporting, if we don't have people telling their stories, if we don't know what's taking place on our workplace because people don't feel comfortable to say it, then we can't change it. So the more that we can tell people and show them that by talking about it, it will make the difference. You know, the courage of the women who came forward to tell their stories, the bravery, we need to make sure that that is the difference that we make with this.
You hear, Chris?
I think great responses, and I think it is understanding the data and acting on it. I think the other thing is that it may be clumsy to start off with, having the conversations and the language, because it's unfamiliar in some workplaces. But the more we do it, the more we learn from each of those, and it's very important that we take the learnings. One thing I'll add as well is I returned into mining into Roy Hill in 2017, and one of my roles was working on a project. I spent a lot of time on site in mining operations, went to all the shift changes, and they were 100% male. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it changed the type of conversations because people were not familiar. In 2022, it's about 19 up to 21% female representation. That's not the point. The point is that the diversity has brought and encouraged a lot of different conversation. And I think that's a really key point, is that it does take time. That's a number of years between that, but it does change the conversation. It makes it a lot more open, and that's what we've seen.
Caitlin, we've got a question here. I mean, Professor Parker put up some data this morning around hostility and sexual coercion, and sort of therefore what it did to people's likelihood to leave the industry and things like that. But the question just asking in relation to the impacted people that you have spoken to that have shared their stories with you through your reporting, where are they now and have they stayed in the industry?
I would say that quite a few of the people who I've spoken to have left the industry. One even left the state. So it has a huge impact, and that data, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's so many people who would be turning away from this industry because of the experiences they've had. I've had friends who, one of their first shifts, someone would sexually harass them, and that was it. They changed industry like that. So we are having an issue with labour shortage in this country. If you want to be capitalising on, 50% of Australia, if you want women in this industry, you really need to clean up workplaces and make them safe for people.
Yeah, sorry, go for it, Chris, but a real reminder of the why that I think we've heard consistently from opening presentation right the way through today. Yeah,
certainly from your presentation initially around diversity in the workforce as well, and I think media is a great change agent. It's in terms of its impact, and congratulations, Caitlin, on your award. It's really helped us to get to a tipping point. I think there's an opportunity as well is to highlight the good news stories about mining as well, and report some of the initiatives that go on throughout the mining industry, because what we want to do is attract diversity into the workplace, and we don't want to continue. We have to report on incidents, but we also want to report on what is actually positive, so we actually attract females into the industry.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of territory in our conversation. So as we wrap up this panel, I'd love to just turn to each of you for a closing reflection or thought that you'd love to leave the audience thinking about as we head into the lunch break. Might start with you, Sally, and work the way down.
So from a reporting perspective, I think the takeaway would be just to understand both what you do know and what you don't know. And if you don't know those things at the moment, I'd encourage you to take that as a takeaway and find out a bit more about what your data tells you and also what it doesn't.
Excellent. Caitlin?
I would say listen to your workforce, provide them opportunities to tell their stories. One person's story can be incredibly important and impactful, and it might not be isolated story as well. That's what we found throughout this inquiry, that people felt that they were alone, that no one else was going through the same experiences as them. But we now know that it is an ongoing issue that the industry needs to face. I'd also just like to say that I think one of the things that I would like to see more of in the industry is more female representation, and I know that the industry is working towards that. But also leadership. Female leadership within the industry, I think, could really help diversify workplaces and also help stamp out this issue.
And just on the first point there, to link to the contractor session that was in here before, the comment around when workforce does the education itself, so that peer-to-peer learning, sharing of stories, the richness of outcomes that come from that versus when they're sitting in a room having learning delivered at them by someone they don't have a relationship with. So that piece around allowing that exchange, it's just interesting, the overlap in both those sessions. Rebecca?
I think taking Caitlin's point around listening to each other, and we talked this morning about having 1,100 people in the room who are clearly change agents, who are wanting to see this amplified, is that when you've listened, do something.
Here, Chris?
Yeah, I think as well to Caitlin's point is that we address the incidents through reporting, but effort on creating an environment where diversity thrives and you get high-performing teams. It's a long game, but it's absolutely critical.
And can I be cheeky and take 2 bites at that?
Go
I would
for it.
grab a copy of the latestly released Safe and Respectful Behaviours Action Plan from industry to look at the on-ground pieces that our industry is undertaking to make real change in this area.
Awesome. Well, as Chris said there, it might be a long game, but it's certainly the right game. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you're putting in, not only in the room today, engaging in this conversation, shaping the chat that we just had, but certainly beyond it as change agents, as was touched on, in your respective organisations and broadly within the industry. Can you join me in thanking our panel for a really fantastic conversation?